All right, if everybody is ready, let me start with the introduction. We're going to start at the end of the table. One of the producers of the film, Mr. Christopher CLEMENTS. Carolyn HEPBURN, another producer. Julie GOLDMAN, producer. We have Christine VACHON, producer of the film. I think, Christine, you started working with Todd in 1991, was it? With Poison? Yeah. You guys are kind of knowing each other very well. And the editor of the film, KURNITZ, who did a terrific job. And last, but really not least, the director of the Velvet Underground, who was in Cannes for the first time. He was 3 times in competition before, Mr. Todd HAYNES. All right. I'm going to start with a couple of questions, and then I will open the floor. Question for you, Todd. It's a very simple and very complicated question at the same time, and it's in 2 parts. Why the Velvet, and how the Velvet?
Both of the questions are linked to a series of events that occurred around the time Laurie Anderson, who was Lou Reed's partner, after he passed away, decided to put his papers in, make his papers available to the New York Public Library. And Laurie, with Lou Reed's sister Meryl, controlled the publishing of the songs. And is that true? Or is it just Laurie?
No,
They share it.
Yeah.
And around this time, and the masters are controlled by Universal Music Group, and a man by the name of David Blackman, who runs music, TV, and video there. I think there was discussions about an opportunity that a time had arisen for the possibility of a documentary being made with the material, and if Laurie could give her blessing to a director. And I think that's when they came to me and asked me if I would be interested, and through Christine, and I was immediately. It was the first documentary that I'd ever done or considered doing, but there was no question about the meaning and the content of this story and what it really meant to me in my life as music and as a cultural moment. So that's the sort of the where and the why.
Question for the producer. The film is so rich in terms of archival footage. It's unbelievable what you guys found. I mean, I don't know where you got it. And was it difficult to get all this and to get all the rights? I know it's a process. And where did you find all this? And how did you get all this? I don't know who wants to answer.
Sure. It was very difficult. It's 2.5 hours of archive in a 2-hour film. So that was a first for us. But yeah, I mean, it was. From the beginning, there's one key thing, which was the relationship to the Warhol Museum. And we knew that was going to be really key and important. So that was, from the very start, something that we worked on. And that worked out wonderfully in the end. Anthology Film Archives, there were various big archives. And then there were the people, the fans, like the hidden materials. And you should talk a little bit about.
Yeah, we collaborated a lot with, like Julie was saying, kind of the super fans. So there's people like Phil Milstein, who is he was the founder of the Velvet Underground Appreciation Society. And he would tell us about all of these appearances and concerts and just lead us in the right direction of where things could be found and who had some great photos and how to contact them. And so a lot of fans like that, like Johan Kugelberg, he has a company called Boo Hooray, and he has a huge archive of Velvet ephemera and posters, and that's where we first found that tape of Lou at the very end when he's talking to Andy. That wound up being at the Warhol Museum, but we first discovered that through Johan. He had a VHS he kind of found.
And also photographers, which
Yes.
were key at the time. There were several really important ones, and Danny Williams, his material, just, it was a surge. And we had really wonderful people who worked with us on that. We had Wyatt and Brian and Daniel and Marissa. We had a really wonderful team of people, and Stephen.
But it was finding people like M.M. Sarah at the Filmmaker Co-op, finding these very independent films, finding the right print of it and getting that transferred. We found a film called Super Artist that was about Warhol, that the only copy of it is in MoMA when it was shown there in 1968, and they have it in their archive, and they had to dig it out of their archive, and we get it transferred, and I don't think it's really been shown since 1968, so just to have that in our film was an amazing thing to access.
And Christian Favre.
And Christian Favre, yes, Christian Favre, he put on an exhibition of the Velvet Underground in Paris. I think it was in 2016 when
Something
around
like
there.
that,
So
about 5 years ago or more.
Yeah, so he already made connections to a lot of people just because it was a very massive exhibit. So he also helped guide us in the right direction of finding people and making that contact with them.
You want to add something?
And I just wanted to say that the nice thing about actually, it sounds arduous, but it's fantastic to actually go spelunking to find all this stuff, because you do know that it's decaying wherever it is. And so when you decide to make a movie, you're also participating in preserving this material for archives in the future. And so that's part of what making documentaries and doing this kind of research is really, really satisfying.
And Adam, they came to you and they said, we have all these tons of footage in all formats, and deal with it. Your work is terrific on the film, by the way.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Yeah, I think in the end, just mathematically, it came to like 600 hours of footage. And then there were the photographs as well, and I think there must have been 7,000 to 8,000 photographs to go through. So it took a little while, but they gave me all the time in the world. It was amazing to work with this footage. Really, really amazing.
Christine, as we said before, it's not your first rodeo with Todd. Is it different because it's a different approach?
Yes, I mean, it was one of the reasons I knew that Todd would be interested in doing this, not only because I already knew you loved the band, but I knew that it was a challenge. It would really be something that he had never done before and that I really hadn't done before either. And, thank goodness we found Motto so that, who really, I think, were able to help us preserve the sort of freshness and originality that Todd was able to bring to the table, at the same time, make sure we didn't go off the rails.
Yeah, they helped us organize, and this is always a challenge, I think, with any documentary film, is the time and the money allotment over a long period of time. And the editor I use on most of my films is Afonso Gonçalves, who wasn't able to be here with us. Fonzie had worked with Adam on the Jim Jarmusch film, The Stooges, and I was introduced to Adam in New York, knowing that Fonzie and I needed to try to get these interviews shot first in 2018, then go off and do my film Dark Waters, and leave all the material with Adam in New York while Fonzie and I were working on Dark Waters. And then by the time the beginning of 2020 hit and our Dark Waters had been released, then Fonzie and I were fully available to join Adam and spend all of our time. And it's right when COVID, so those months were the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and it locked us into this extraordinary experience where we had really collected and amassed all of the databases, all the photo archives. For the most part, we kept collecting, we kept adding to it, but it was a time where we could really hunker down. And I got quarantined with Fonzie in Los Angeles, so we literally could be together every day working. And Adam, we missed, but we spoke to about 20 times a day.
Yeah.
And swapped cuts
Yeah, I was
millions of
cutting in
times
New
a
York,
day.
you guys were cutting. It worked really well.
It worked really well.
Yeah.
You guys shared screen on Zoom and work on like that?
We did Zoom quite a bit.
We did Zoom quite a bit, but
Yeah.
we mostly would just send cuts. We'd send what we had just cut on that day, and we'd watch it and talk about it. We'd get on the phone and
Yeah.
all talk, and then we'd get into the day's work based on those notes.
Yeah.
I just want to say how extraordinary that is for Todd, as the director, to actually be there in the trenches in that way, in such a profound way, editing the film with Adam and Fonz. It was, and it was kind of one of the benefits of that moment, of that terrible moment, that there was the ability for them to all actually gather and spend those months, and it just made the film just more beautiful.
But I will say, actually, we managed ad hoc to figure out how to work when we had the restrictions in place. And Todd really directs from a distance quite well, too. So when we couldn't get together, we still had, Adam always had direction, so he always knew where he was going in the edit, so it never stopped moving forward.
Also, I wanted to add that Todd did some of the editing also.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Well, there were some silver linings to this crisis. I guess we have a question right here.
Hello, this is Matic Majic. I'm from RTV Slovenia. I have a question for Mr. Haynes. It's actually a very similar question. Despite having all this wonderful footage in your hands, there has always been very little footage of the band performing. So I suppose that was a big challenge in seaming the film together, especially because in the last decades, the notion of a music documentary has become a film where every hour of a musician's life has been filmed, like the documentary on Amy Winehouse, Billie Eilish, and so on, for example. So I just wonder how big of a challenge it was to put all this together, and I think you did an incredibly good job of keeping the film visually interesting. And was that also the reason why we didn't get a documentary on the Velvet Underground for so long, just because there isn't that much of a footage to, to put the visual material together? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it's absolutely true that the band in every conceivable way fell outside of conventions of how bands are promoted, of how bands come together, of the culture in which they are born into. And that included that, no, there was not promotional material or live concert footage. What there was some of the most extraordinary avant-garde cinema ever, with cameras ever aimed on a musical ensemble ever, in the work of Andy Warhol and Danny Williams, who filmed the Velvet Underground. And it became part of their art making. So the way that art making ricocheted back and forth between film and music and fine art and performance and happenings and gallery multimedia exhibitions. This was what defined this particular era in New York City life and cultural life and distinguished it so pronouncedly. So that, for us, became not a hindrance, but an absolute opportunity to tell a story using this extraordinary material. So we based the movie with so much Warhol stuff, had a great relationship with the Warhol Museum and the archivist there and all of that. But I really felt it was important to understand that this was an entire, very fluid network of artists from many, many people making films in New York at the time. And they were swapping each other, and they were using each other in their films, and they were participating in the same events. And so it was an opportunity to tell a story in a way that I felt I'd never seen in a rock doc before, because there's just no comparable time in our cultural history like it. And that, to us, I just think felt like this embarrassment of riches. These extraordinarily beautiful pieces of work, very different. Not all these filmmakers are like Warhol's work, but they all knew each other, and they all hung out together. They all swapped ideas, and they were, breaking boundaries and breaking conventions. And that was the spirit of the culture, and we wanted that to be really felt in the finished film.
Chaz, please.
Thank you. Chaz Ebert from the Chicago Sun-Times and RogerEbert.com. Todd, you and Christine make such beautiful, sensitive movies. I just love, and I'm always glad to see you on any stage in any part of the world. And Julie Goldman, I have to tell you, I've talked to many people who've worked with you. They tell me what a hard worker you are, and I've seen your documentaries, and they are beautiful and impactful. What I want to ask is, a documentary filmmaker very rarely gets a chance to switch over to making a narrative film because people don't have a certain expectation of a documentary filmmaker. And for a narrative filmmaker to switch over, you did answer a little bit of how the music and the culture and the archives that you had helped you. But you bring such an auteurist, I would say, view to your movies. What did you bring to this from your narrative filmmaking that helped this documentary film become something different? Is my question to you. And Julie Goldman, how was it working with this group?
Thank you for that question. I think part of it is when the prospect is how to tell a film, make a film about music. And I've done this in other films of mine that are fictional, and about specific artists and their stories and their relationships to their creative process. To me, the first question is always, why should it be a film? What is visual about this music? How can we make a correlation between how you feel when you listen to the music and what you're gonna see on the screen? So we had and collected the most extraordinary interviews from the people we assembled. And my rule was that let's just talk to the people who were there. Because as we all know, there are sort of endless lists of people who followed these years and who were inspired by the Velvet Underground, who could say great things about them. But it was too much. I wanted to really focus on the time and place. But I didn't want the film to be about the words. I wanted the film to be about the music and the images. And so I think that was really my hope, that by putting the music in the context of the filmmaking that was happening, and film was intrinsically linked to music making in this particular story. So I wasn't imposing this idea onto it. They all lived and breathed this experimental cinema, and they were all sharing, the Velvet Underground basically formed by backing, as a backing band, before they were named the Velvet Underground, a series of screenings that Jonas Mekas would put together that were multimedia events that would have different films being shown, and they needed music for it. So they came out there, or John Cale worked on the soundtracks of Jack Smith's films while living at the Ludlow Street apartment in the Lower East Side. So film and art and music making were all informing each other. So that's really where I hoped that you could hear the music in a fresh way. It would sort of prick you into that experience that might be akin to what people felt at the time, hearing that music when it was being made.
And for us, so it's Chris, Carolyn, and I, our motto, we have a company, and we heard about the project, and we went and had lunch with Todd and Christine, and obviously, huge admirers of both of them and of the band, and this was like, okay, dream project, somebody just described it. And then we had lunch, and this was what you were saying, and it's storytelling. And Todd's a wonderful storyteller, and so we didn't have a doubt that we could support his vision and bring that to life, and that's really what happened. I mean, we just worked together all along the way with Todd and Christine to really bring this to life, because what Todd just described is what he knew at the time, and it became richer and richer and richer along the way.
Hi, from Variety. I was just wondering what the biggest challenge was about making a documentary feature compared to, working from a screenplay, basically.
The biggest challenge, I would say, is the people who weren't alive, who were such central figures, namely Lou Reed. And not wanting to have the integrity of our filmed documentaries that we all did at the same time, not be sort of splintered or with archival documentary images of Lou Reed. Like, we used his voice from archival material, a lot, but to keep having his presence be sort of imbued into the film, I think was the biggest one of the challenges. And so, but it does some interesting things where, and there's so many beautiful stills, and there's great material of him from the time, gorgeous Warhol films. Even just, we've all seen those images of the screen tests, you know, the gorgeous, mostly in stills, because the lighting is so fantastic and they all look so great and sexy. And but I've never really, until we started to put this together, watched an entire screen test from beginning to end, an entire reel play. And all of a sudden, you feel like the person is there. They're breathing. They're holding still, but there's little glances that they make that seem to almost be referring to things that we are then stating and depicting in the frame beside it. And so you feel like you're really in the time and place in an extraordinary way, with an original 16-millimeter reel of Lou Reed sitting, you know, with half shadow and half light on his face. And we have these images of him throughout all the years that he was at the factory. So we could also sort of use these as ways of showing him evolve and change. And the same with John, and the same with the other band members. So there were, I think, the ways we had to come up with solutions to feeling his presence were forced us to continue to think out of the box and come up with solutions that we might not have otherwise if we had all of the available material that most rock docs might have.
Clemens, first row.
Hello, I'm from Serbia, Srđan Jakanović. And I always thought that New York City has a unique scene, music scene in the States. And I wonder if you can tell me what was the relationship of Velvet Underground with New York and the rest of America? Were there any difference in that relationship? And if you can tell me, for your opinion, who was keeper of that torch of New York music scene after Velvet Ground in the 70s or 80s up till now? Thank you.
There's no question that New York City, the film is, you know, in some ways as much a portrait of New York City as it is this band. It's almost hard to separate those two subjects. And it makes you think of other times and places in any history where there's a geographical kind of compression of people all in the same place, you know? And that their cultural heritage and their immigrant pasts and the various things that they bring, particularly in America, which is a country of immigrants, ends up creating, like in New Orleans in the jazz era, or in, you know, Kansas City later in the jazz era, like it's art comes out of that condensation of people and places. That was really true for New York City, true for the Velvet Underground, true for the Warhol scene and all of that stuff. And we hope that that comes through in the movie. But what I didn't really know until we were doing the movie is how much that also shifted. And they started to spend all this time playing in Boston. And, you know, Jonathan Richman, who is one of our featured interviewees in the film, and an amazing musician who was so inspired by the Velvet Underground, saw the band 80 times at the Boston Tea Party in Boston. And so the band, it sort of became their new home away from home. We also talk about what happened when they went to the West Coast and the way that almost reinforced the kind of cultural attitudes and identity of New York City in ways they didn't even realize how complicit they were in a series of ideas and resistances to the counterculture at large until they left New York City and went to the West Coast. Look, I think to just answer your last question briefly, my own opinion is that the Velvet Underground inspired so many genres of music that are almost inconceivable to think about without their existence in advance. And to me, the first one was glam rock, and David Bowie being the first person to play covers of the Velvet Underground music before anybody knew the Velvet Underground was. And so London and New York kind of developed an infatuation with each other that resulted in glam rock. But then punk rock started to emerge and challenge the kind of artifice and camp of glam rock. And that occurred in London and in New York and in Detroit and in Cleveland and in all of these other cities in the United States and in Los Angeles. And then it went on from there, and new wave music developed a kind of ironic, slightly more distanced and very much self-conscious artistic kind of attitude about rock. And you saw that, again, coming out of New York City and the art schools that were around the United States. So it did end up, I think it really did describe places in time. And that's something today I just don't know as much about because of the dispersal of information in our internet and digital lives, that we don't necessarily concentrate physically in one place anymore. And so how does that art get generated when there isn't that physical compression of people in one place? Because I do think that's a really special part of this story.
Sir, please.
Hello, Daniel Kodenschulde, Frankfurter Rundschau. I love the film, thank you very much. I wonder, I especially like the use of avant-garde film to go with the music. So I wonder how you decided what to show. I even noticed that there was an Oscar Fischinger film from 1931. So I was just wondering, what was the main ambition behind it? And the second question is, I love the photography of cinematography of Ed Lachman again, as always in your work. And was he shooting on 16? Just two questions.
Ed shot digital for the actual interviews, but we shot Super 8 footage of every single subject, which we used in our editorially in different ways to kind of introduce some of the subjects. But really from the very beginning, the passion, I think, was about trying to embrace the avant-garde filmmaking of this period. And yes, it's a broader spectrum. There's Maya Deren in there. There's Fischinger. There's Vanderbeek. There's filmmakers that stand outside the specific era that we're talking about. And there's Kenneth Anger, who wasn't necessarily a New York-based filmmaker, but a West Coast-based filmmaker. So it's about a kind of spirit of the avant-garde that certainly preceded the 60s in New York, but reached an apex of production and output in the 60s that we've never seen the likes of before, where very, very important films like Jack Smith's Flaming Creatures, Andy Warhol's Chelsea Girls, Kenneth Anger's Scorpio Rising, were films that actually entered the mainstream and were reviewed by critics who would normally be reviewing feature films, and given a different kind of serious attention than they ever had before. And that was just all part of the ways that boundaries were breaking down, you know, at that particular time. That was another part of how this music came to be.
Talking about boundaries breaking down, the film will be released globally on Apple TV+. There's a lot of stuff happening there. I mean, there's a lot of musical documentaries. Spike Jonze about Beastie Boys was really good. Do you feel that's two questions in one? Is there a movement or something happening around documentaries? Maybe a question for all of us guys, all of you guys. Is there a movement for documentaries on streamers? Something happening? A certain freedom that this new media is giving you guys? And also, do we consider the work differently when we know that it's going to be on the streamers?
Well, I mean, we didn't know this was going to be on a streamer when we made the film. So we made the film, it's a cinematic film. It will be released in cinemas. So in addition to being on Apple TV+. So they embraced that cinematic, the way that the film was made. And so I mean, it's very hard to tell who sees what, where they're going to see it these days. But it's, for us, it's just, I would say the more opportunities we have for our films to be seen, the more we embrace that. But we love working with a company that also sees that this is cinema and it should be seen that way as well.
And it should be noted also that audiences have evolved. Documentary has become a medium that is allowed to be more creative in telling the story. And the nice thing about doing documentary is that the control track is the reality. You're trying to tell the real story. However, the audience has the ability to see things in a creative context and experience it. The documentaries used to be much more rigid. They used to be much more like reportage, and that was it. So I think there's a back and forth between the audience and documentary filmmakers now that's richer, and I think it's just going to keep expanding.
I totally agree with you. I think it's going to be, it may be announcing a new golden age of documentary, is this way of these new exposures that they're getting. Do you feel that the audience will be more demanding because of that, in terms of the stories that the documentaries are telling and the way that it's told?
I hope so. I like to see audiences become more sophisticated and exacting and demanding, and I think they have that potential. I will say, as an old school filmmaker who makes movies for the big screen first and foremost, watching it last night here at the festival and hearing it, particularly hearing it in a theater, seeing it on the big screen, of course, but hearing it, a movie like this where the soundtrack is so important, there's nothing like it. And so that will still be, you know, a priority for me in the way we release the film and figure out the ways that it's going to come out in different cities.
If I must say, Monsieur, you are one of my favorite artists, and I love when you talk about other artists. I mean, when you did I'm Not There, it was wonderful. What you did there is great. Is there kind of any hesitation to talk about the work of other artists when you're an artist like you?
I don't know if there's a hesitation. I think I do feel like it's always an interpretation and a translation in my own imperfect way of music or historical moments that I'm trying to kind of, represent. But in doing so, it's always about sort of, again, trying to figure out why should this be a film? What is the visual and stylistic language that conveys this artist's uniqueness? And that's what I'm always searching for and sort of, bearing down on myself to come up with those answers. So that a film about glam rock has to be a stylized pageant of irony and falsity and self-fiction making, right? And a film about Bob Dylan has to sort of multiply into many different characters who are utterly committed to their moment and their style of music, but who keep dying off and handing the baton to the next one, because that was the way Dylan creatively survived, I think. So in each case, it's sort of trying to find the method that best conveys at least my feelings about what that music is about.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. One here.
I have another question for Mr. Haynes. When I was younger, I always thought that making a documentary on the Velvet Underground would be something like making a documentary on Bob Dylan, for example, because there were so many myths around the band, so many unclear events. So I'm not going to ask you if your intention was to demystify the band, but whether there were any events that you decided to leave out just because they were historically unclear or not... You didn't think they would be good to fit into this historical narrative. Thank you.
There's a lot left out. I mean, there's a lot left out of any film. And in a way, it's really important to know that you're always leaving stuff out. And that's okay. In this case, it's not a sex, drugs, and rock and roll gossip movie. It doesn't, and somebody could make that film about the Velvet Underground, and it would be super fun and interesting, but we really wanted to embrace the cultural life of New York City and the artistic integrity and how complicated and deep that history was and how rich and beautiful and how much we had in avant-garde cinema to visualize that in a film, right? And again, it was something that was just sitting there. It wasn't like something we forced onto the story. It's just that it's about the art making. And Ellen Willis sort of described the Velvet Underground at the end of the 1970s, sort of reappraising them a decade after they'd broken up, as rock and roll art, in a way that she really couldn't find a comparable example for in music. Dylan had done amazing things to what was possible in a popular song. But I think the term rock and roll art meant that there was a kind of collaborative cross-pollination going on from different influences that were affecting it. It really was a band. It wasn't just a single voice standing up there and telling us their vision of the world. It was every member of that band, particularly on that first record, was essential to the sound. So how they all found each other and the miracle of those people from all these different places, like landing in New York City at that one moment and ending up with this music, was something we really wanted to sort of excavate, but do it in the context of this absolutely unique artistic moment in New York life.
Since we're talking about the music, to conclude this press conf, I'm going to ask you, each and every one of you, your favorite song from The Velvet. Let's start with you, monsieur.
Heroin. Heroin.
It's so hard.
And I want an answer.
Yeah, okay, the pressure is on. I'm going to say I'll Be Your Mirror.
I was going to say I'll Be Your Mirror because it's been in my head ever since last night. I'll throw all tomorrow's parties out.
I really have to pass. I would say the first record, because I can't really take it apart, which is not fair. It's cheating.
Yeah, I'm all tomorrow's parties too.
I'm Venus and Furs. I'll take two because you missed one. Venus and Furs and Sister Ray.
Very cool.
Eh bien, écoutez, thank you very much for this press conference. Thank you
you.
so much. Adam Ernest, Christine Vachon, Todd HAYNES, Julie Goodman, Carolyn HEPBURN, and Christopher CLEMENTS. Thank you so much, and bravo for the film. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was fun.